Welcome to TSAT. Today I am going to discuss about the technologies of disaster management. So, in this case of technologies of disaster management, for example, mapping is a technology of disaster management. In the case of mapping, as I have specified, zoning is more important here. So, to know the way the disaster is impacting a region, we need to have an idea or to the extent where the disaster is impacting. The map gives you a clear-cut idea, an area which is being impacted, which is not going to be impacted by a specific type of disaster. So, in this context, because in this proactive regime, we need to prepare certain thematic maps in terms of a theme representing a region which is being impacted by a cyclone, a map individually identifying a region which can be impacted by earthquakes, a region which is being impacted by drought, a region which is being impacted by floods. So, on this basis, when you have got different variant types of maps, what happens is the administrator will be having an idea very clearly that what are the regions being affected, where certain kind of activities need to be done, mitigative activities need to be done to avoid the disaster. The mapping helps a lot. When these maps are being made, supplied to the public, or when they are being relayed in electronic media, what happens is many people will be aware of the disaster management, so that what are the areas where we can use for more human habitations, or what are the areas need to be avoided to avoid these kind of dangerous consequences, where mapping helps us in this process of zoning. Next technology is aerial photography, pre-disaster and post-disaster conditions. So, here aerial photography, you might have observed in the news bulletin that the chief ministers and the prime ministers traveling in a helicopter observing the inundated, impacted, vulnerable region. The reason behind it is one must be able to estimate what has happened, to what extent people are being affected, what is the loss of a property, what is the loss in terms of agriculture. For this, we need to have an aerial photograph. Now, there is possibility of doing this kind of photography not only with these kinds of helicopters or aeroplanes or drones. Nowadays, we can have an aerial photographs with the help of satellites also. So, in this context, when you are comparing a region before the occurrence of a disaster and after the occurrence of a disaster, this gives you a clear-cut idea to the extent being impacted. So, this is being made possible with technology, having an aerial photography. Communication is one such technology which I have discussed with you in the previous session, where you must have a kind of communication mechanism which will be working even during a disaster. The example which I have given to you is a satellite phone. Even though the existing infrastructure fails, the satellite phones will be working because they are directly linked to the satellite. So, a satellite phone is an alternative mechanism or a technology which is helpful for the purpose of communication. A radio, which is also a traditional technology, is further serving you the existing requirement, because radios transmission doesn't require a kind of antenna. Directly, the ionosphere, a layer in the atmosphere, can act as a reflecting layer for transmission of radio signals. So, these are some communicative devices which help you in disaster management. Logistics main idea is to make the essential service and resource available to a region when the existing type of transportation mechanism fails. The aim of the logistic is, under any circumstances, the essential goods and services need to be made available to the vulnerable population, is the aim of logistics, by using alternative transport mechanism, as I have specified, in terms of using helicopter, drones kind of transportation mechanism when the roadway fails due to earthquakes. Epidemiology is the study of diseases. So, one need to know the prognosis of a disease, means the way a disease progresses. So, the corona spreads in terms of a first wave, second wave, third wave. So, understanding the way a disease spreads is an epidemiology, or understanding the different stages of disease in an individual, the different kinds of symptomatic characters on the basis of which diagnosis need to be done. So, the specific act can be taken, or kind of medicines at a specific time need to be used to save ourselves. So, epidemiology is studying about diseases, whether it is been caused by a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or any other factor, and taking necessary steps when you have got specific knowledge. Yes, corona is being spread through air, so we are using mask because we have got the knowledge about the way it spreads. So, when the knowledge of a disease is aware, the necessary steps need to be taken will help us to avoid the disease. So, this is all about epidemiology, knowing about the diseases, treatment, medicines, etc., so that we can save ourselves. Next, disaster preparedness. As I have discussed in the previous sessions, you need to have certain prepared mechanisms, storing medicines in advance, having alternative transport systems, having legislation is a preparedness, prepositioning personal forces is a preparedness. For example, concentration on vulnerable sections. So, in this case of disaster preparedness, a region which has been impacted by inundation, or a people or an age group which has been impacted, you must be able to identify so that you can minimize the loss of life and property. That is what concentration on a vulnerable section is a preparedness. Mitigation of disaster management is made in two ways. One is structural and the second is non-structural mitigation. So, in the process of mitigative measures, when the classification is being asked in terms of mitigative measures, you must be able to differentiate between structural mitigation and non-structural mitigation. So, here in this case, to make you understand what is a structural mitigation and you know what mitigation is. Mitigation is certain steps which you are going to take before the occurrence of the disaster and after the occurrence of the disaster to minimize the loss of life and property. So, in the case of structural mitigations, for example, there is a mechanism or a way of construction of buildings which are earthquake proof buildings. Means even though there is an earthquake, certain constructions can resist the impact of an earthquake. So, it is a structure being constructed to avoid the destruction is a structural mitigation. For example, you have got old structures which have been constructed without following any earthquake proof measures. So, what you need to do when you have already constructed? In this context, for example, take the case of public buildings like hospitals or public hospitals or schools, municipal buildings, etc. They can be fortified. So, fortification means adding additional columns at the ground floor or strengthening the columns by supporting a horizontal or a 45-degree angle support concrete structures to the main columns, so that the strength of the building increases, so that you can avoid or strengthen the building to collapse, avoiding collapsing of the building. For example, to avoid floods, percolation tanks, when it is being mandatory to all the buildings in all the metropolitan cities, when it is being mandatory, what happens is, when the percolation tanks means the water which is being precipitated due to the rain, when it is not being connected to the drain sewage, when it is being connected to a percolation tank within the building at the ground level, what happens is the water will not get into the drainage and the water will be percolated down into the ground, so that it has got a double-edged advantage. One is it increases the water table, avoiding drought. The second is urban flooding can be avoided, because when there is a cloud burst, the volume of water precipitated is so high in a very short duration, where the sewage will not be able to accommodate the precipitated water leading to flooding of urban habitations. So, percolation tank is a structural mitigation. Fortification of the world buildings is a structural mitigation. Having a new construction technology is a structural mitigation, which are being made mandatory in terms of a legislation. And non-structural mitigation is a legislation. So, for example, certain rules and regulations need to be followed is a non-structural mitigation. For example, during disaster, the kind of rights available to the citizens vary. Is a law being made? So, here in this case, you do not find any kind of structure, a law where the citizens of a country need to behave accordingly during a specific condition. A legislation is not a structure, is a law which prevents a disaster. So, for example, as I have given in the first episode regarding the institutional structure of disaster management, NDMA structure is based upon a legislation, is a non-structural mitigation. So, and these structural and non-structural mitigation varies from disaster to disaster. For example, the structural mitigation in the case of an earthquake and a cyclone varies. In the case of a cyclone, you need to construct a cyclone shelter in the higher elevated regions, is a structural mitigation, whereas in the case of earthquake, you need to fortify the existing buildings, is a different mode of structural mitigation. So, laws need to be made during warfare, laws need to be made during earthquakes, inundation, pandemic, or non-structural mitigations. Disasters are also been where they have been classified, or there are different types of disasters based upon the rate at which they attack you. For example, rapid onset disasters. For example, without any warning, if an incident or a hazard happens all of a sudden, leading to a lot of destruction, is being described as a rapid onset disaster. For example, an earthquake happens without a warning. When a disaster happens slowly without any kind of noticing you gradually, for example, drought is not a rapid onset disaster. This happens slowly over a period of time with the decreasing in the availability of amount of rainfall to life forms. So, a drought can be given as a classic example of slow onset disaster. Earthquake can be given as an example of a sudden rapid onset disaster. So, this is how even disaster types can be explained. So, there are different sectors in disaster management. So, what are these different sectors in disaster management need to be managed, and what are the different sectors which are being impacted because of the disaster? These sectors are being divided into direct and indirect sectors, because when a direct sector is being impacted, the effect on you will be more and you will be directly impacted. Whereas in the case of indirect effect is not so direct, and the impact to an extent will be a little bit less when compared to direct. So, for example, health directly impacts you physically, housing directly impacts you physically, agriculture, the availability of food is being impacted, economic activities, social sector, when you lose a job, where you have observed this in this pandemic. So, these are a social sector is family, many people died, the head of the families died. So, because of this reason, there is the structure of the family itself is being destructed because of these disasters. So, because when we lose a member in the family, the structure disturbs in the case of these disasters. So, these are direct sectors: health, housing, agriculture, economic activities in terms of the jobs, and social sector means in terms of society, family is a social sector. So, these are direct, these have got a direct impact on us. Apart from this, in the case of urban settlements, for example, indirect impact in terms of transportation, lifeline like power or hospitals or critical facilities, when they are being impacted, indirectly we get impacted, but to an extent we will be able to survive for some days. without this. But direct impacting sectors, survival itself becomes a question. That is the fundamental difference between these sectors which are direct and indirect. After understanding this mechanism, there is a mechanism to prevent disaster and there is a mechanism to mitigate. Mitigation, as I have already mentioned the meaning, mitigations are a range of activities which are before the disaster and after the disaster to reduce the impact and consequences of the hazard is known as mitigation. So, what are these preventive mechanisms? Avoiding harmful phenomena and effects. So for example, cloud seeding, avoiding drought. So what do you mean by cloud seeding? Cloud seeding is a mechanism where you are spreading certain aerosols in the minimum available clouds to accelerate the rate of condensation. When the rate of condensation is accelerated, it leads to precipitation, means it leads to rainfall. So here, even though rainfall is not available naturally, you are able to create a kind of condition for rainfall to happen so that you can avoid a drought. So for example, silver iodide is being used previously. Now, because silver iodide is more costly as an aerosol to spread in the clouds available, bismuth trichloride nowadays being used because economically, when you consider as far as investment cost is considered, silver iodide is highly costly. So what are you doing is you are spraying these kind of aerosols or kind of dust particles in the clouds. As the dust particles increases the rate of condensation, means increasing the rate of condensation means converting the water vapor to droplets of water. When the droplets of water being formed are more, they collide with one another, which are suspending in the air, known as clouds, leading to increasing in the size of the water droplet, subjecting to gravity, leading to precipitation. So this is the advantage with cloud seeding can avoid drought. So cloud seeding avoid drought. Land use pattern is a preventive mechanism. So land, depending upon the topographical features, a region might be a low-lying, a region might be faulted. So on this basis, mountain slopes must be used for a different activity. So a certain region can be used for an agriculture, certain regions must only be used for housing, certain regions must only used for industries. So to avoid pollution or to other disasters, etc. So the land use pattern need to be demarcated for these different kinds of activities which I have specified. Land use pattern, agricultural practices. So for example, using certain water conservative mechanisms like drip irrigation or sprinklers can avoid drought. Even though the average precipitation, the precipitation existing in this season, if it is less than the average, when you use a mechanism to conserve water, you don't experience drought because food will be available, employment will be available. So an agricultural practice using a different kind of technology like sprinklers and drip irrigation, water essential to irrigate an acre of land through canal irrigation will be sufficient enough to irrigate 10 acres of land, so that the agricultural production can be made more with a minimum availability of water. The change in the technology is an agricultural practice. The direction of plowing on the basis of the slope gradient of your plot being cultivated. So if the slope gradient is in one direction, the plowing must be perpendicular to the direction of the slope, so that weathering and erosion of the soil can be avoided, is an agricultural practice. Mulching is an agricultural practice. For example, adding certain dairy waste, domestic waste, adding certain coir to the soil increases the organic composition. With the increasing in the organic composition, the water holding capability of the soil increases. Increasing in the essential soil organisms which are helpful for the soil health. These are all different agricultural practices need to be followed by the farmer to avoid a drought. So Pre-positioning supplies, which I have discussed. So, you need to place certain infrastructural mechanisms, food, medicines, vaccines, etc. in advance, and equipment. Predicting secondary threats. So, when there is a first wave, there is possibility of a second wave is a prediction. When there is a primary tremors, you must be able to expect a secondary shock waves. Is a preparedness predicting mechanism for an earthquake and a pandemic. So, one must have a predicting capability of different diversified disasters. We are able to predict a warfare with China. So, you have moved troops in advance to Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh with the help of imaging of satellites by observing the movement of troops. Is a prediction mechanism. So, in this process of disaster management, there are certain phases which we need to follow in the disaster management. So, what are the different phases we need to follow accordingly to avoid these disasters? So, one is a preparatory phase. You must be prepared in advance. So, what is the preparatory mechanism we have got to avoid disaster? For example, we have got an organization. We must have an organization to avoid this. The organization which we have made is NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority. In the first part, I have discussed the institutional structure of disaster management is an organization. Because when there is an organization, there will be coordination of action. When there is coordination of action, there will be a economy of resource. Resource will be better utilized. Saving of time will happen because of coordination. Coordination happens only because of organization. The organization we have got is NDMA, legislation. So, this NDMA is being established and executed on the basis of a legislation being made known as Disaster Management Act 2005 is a legislation which has specified that there are certain authoritative levels at different hierarchies. In this hierarchy, the way the executive need to act accordingly. Next, inventories. You need to store certain essential goods and services, transport them to the essential place is an inventory. Response plan. What to do for a cyclone, what to do for an earthquake, what to do for a warfare, etc. need to be planned. Warning phase. So, when you have predicted, you must be able to warn the people in advance. Is one of the major second phase of disaster response. So, when you are able to warn the people, actions can be taken in advance to avoid the loss. For example, prediction of a cyclone, estimating the region being impacted, warning the people and habitats where the coast is being impacted, making them to evacuate. So, warning phase is very important. For example, nowadays, new communication mechanisms of artificial intelligence warns the people through messaging to all the people to their cell phones is a warning phase with the help of technology, with the help of communications. Emergency phase. So, certain actions need to be taken after the occurrence of the disaster is an example of an emergency phase. For example, search and rescue operation. So, immediately when there is a communication available to you what to do after the occurrence of a disaster, you know the location where the disaster has happened, what you will be doing is a search and rescue where the people are stuck in an earthquake or a cyclone, etc. You will be able to identify and rescue them so that loss of life can be prevented. Medical assistance, the doctors, paramedical personnel need to be transported to that particular affected region. Communications, establishing alternative communication systems, temporary shelters, food and water supplies must be provided, especially in the emergency phase to avoid the loss of life. Rehabilitation. So, the people who have been subjected need to be cope up back to their original condition by assisting them economically, through psychologically protecting them, strengthening them, counseling them, These kind of rehabilitation means reconstructing a house back. If they are being affected in terms of health, if they have lost their limbs, etc., they need to be given certain support, artificial limbs, etc., prosthetics need to be provided so that they must be able to lead their normal life. That is what rehabilitation is. Bringing them back to their normal life. We shall meet in the next session in terms of discussing about different types of disasters. Thank you.